I read the integral nature of things, and what struck me a lot was not just what is inside in the various chapters that consist of the book, but the acknowledgement itself. And I thought it was the acknowledgements is one part where you kind of gloss over and at best look for your name there at best. I thought this is fantastic, and I thought I should just read it. How do I, this is part of the acknowledgement, how do I express gratitude for all that has inspired, sustained and prompted me to put fingers to the keyboard? Any reckoning would have to include music, birds, trees, Bengalurian breezes, rain, food, friendships, meditation, and here comes the rub, and last but not the least, academic, political and literary forebears and contemporaries. But such a list would be partial. It would not include the chance remark, gesture or musical phrase that initiated or crystallized the thought, feeling or intuition that eventually found expression here. So, let me just say a heartfelt thank you to all that has enabled me to flourish, to all those who, whether they know it or not, have been my companions on this journey. I think this just sets the stage for the book itself. Lata?
I know you could all be at least in 10 other places right now, and you've taken the time to come here across town, many of you. Thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me to come for a discussion of the book. I thought what I would do just to start the evening was to just situate the work a little bit, just talk a little bit, read a little bit about the work, and then we could move into a more informal conversation. And I thought, in honor of the fact that yesterday we had the absurd parodic moment of 377 being, what shall we say, going, experiencing status quo ante, in other words, having homosexuality recriminalized. I wanted to start with 4 points that I had made, as an opening at the launch of Because I Have a Voice in 2005, at which I was happy to be present. And so it's really a kind of tipping of the hat to this historical moment that I want to begin this way. And I started that presentation with the following 4 remarks. We live in infinity, but social theory is for the most part written as though the world were a finite object that can and must be convincingly, if not exhaustively, described. We have at our disposal language which by its nature constrains our imagination even as it unleashes it. We are situated beings. The stories we tell locate us. How then do we embrace specificity while claiming neither too much nor too little about the worlds we conjure with our words? Even as our concepts slice and dice reality into so many fragments, effectively making such disaggregation the very touchstone of our understanding, the social and natural worlds point to the abiding interconnectedness of phenomena. Contemporary events repeatedly dramatize the impossibility of sectioning, sequestering, partitioning, or isolating one or other element or dimension from the others to which it is complexly related, not to mention the whole of which it is a part. The situation invites radical rethinking of how we construe the world. But there is no sign of an intellectual crisis, at least not as yet. Theories crafted in the 19th century and challenged in the wake of a post-World War II decolonizing world system continue to dominate. New objects of analysis have certainly emerged and introduced their own analytical terms. But these have amounted to extending our concerns to areas of human experience hitherto ignored, or rewriting the history of what is known to include details that we haven't taken into account. What has not happened is a fundamental revising of our approach or method. Cultural studies held the promise of a new way of thinking through old conundrums, whether in dismantling the base superstructure binary or in recasting the relations of structure, subject, and agency. Yet, it too is disappointed on at least two counts. It has at times been seduced by its objects of study, a tendency evident in the absence of critique, or rather the muted character of critique, where one might have expected otherwise. Second, in context of conservative and right-wing challenges to contemporary mass culture and left, feminist or queer frameworks, the culture wars in the US or the fulminations of our own beloved homegrown Sangh Parivar, work in cultural studies has frequently mounted robust defenses of phenomena which properly demand much more nuanced consideration. How do we understand the irony of a potentially radical social critique becoming in effect a kind of facilitator in making normative of some of the miasmas on which the exercise of power in this time depends? I have taken cultural studies as an example, but one could tell a similar kind of story from other disciplinary locations. And again, I should state that this is a very broad strokes picture that I am painting here, and there are always exceptions to every rule. The binary continues to prevail, for or against, either this or that, prohibitive injunction, freedom of choice, faith versus reason, work versus leisure, choice versus obligation, private versus public, mind versus body, faith versus reason. What about the work of leisure and work as leisure, obligatory choice, the public nature of the private, the privatization of the public in the guise of public-private partnership? When multiplicity is acknowledged, it more often than not leads to relativism, or else to what I have described in this book as a republic of difference indifferent to our commonalities. So the essays in this book that we're going to discuss today, The Integral Nature of Things, occupy a place between what one might describe as the concrete and the philosophical or meta-local, philosophical understood not in this disciplinary sense, academic sense, but in the sense of wisdom for everyday life. These essays ask us to think about how we've come to think about things in a particular way and what that obscures or occludes. To really appreciate Beethoven, for example, one has to be able to hear not merely the thunderbolt chords, right? Da, 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 da. I mean, not just that, right? But the soft notes in which they are embedded and with which they form the whole of his composition. Likewise, listening to or observing the world, we need to be able to hear, see, notice the half notes, the muted quarter tones, the spaces between lines and notes. Put another way, I feel we need a language that enables us to pause and reflect on the things we witness, not merely possess facts and figures about them. This is especially the case in a time like ours that is dominated by what one might describe and what has been described by many as technical, managerial, and instrumental thinking. I feel strongly that we need a fresh language, visual, linguistic, analytic, for thinking about urbanism, for telling the story of neoliberal urban development, a line of concern in my recent work. This is why in my own work I have turned to what might be described as multi-genre writing, arguments alongside contemplative prose and first-person accounts. I conceive my writing as a kind of extended invitation to readers to reconsider how we know and experience the world. Final initial comment, politics is not only a contest over access to power, decision-making, and legitimate social authority. It is equally a practice and a space for imagining, indeed reimagining, how we might live with each other and with the rest of the phenomenal world. When we conceive of politics as a struggle for a form of life, for an alternative mode of coexistence, then the state, social, economic, and political institutions represent vectors of interest, but not the entire field of engagement. And it is within this broader understanding of politics as being intrinsically about existential matters that I would situate my own work. So I thought I would sort of lay out a little bit of the land for those who haven't had a chance to look at the book, so you have some sense of where I'm coming from. So that's why I started in that way. Over to you.
I mean, there are many ways of looking at what this book is about, and it eludes genre. It has elements of the personal and the subjective. It is also cultural critique and cultural commentary. It certainly enters political commentary as it moves. But the nice thing about the book I found was that it shifts back and forth across these realms or subjects of understanding, and it continuously retains this this admiration, or rather this fondness for the intimate, just as you were also writing about abstract notions. For example, there are chapters about the tree, the shop, the grass cutter, and then you have that coexisting with a chapter on observation. So what these everyday reflections on your part when you were writing this book that you would want to juxtapose this constant intimate? It's like a Gaston Ballechard kind of thing of the poetics of space, so to speak, and how that connects to the wider world that we live in.
That's a very interesting question. I think there are several reasons why I adopted this mode of writing. Partly because I think, and I'm not the only one to say this, I think it's become very clear that a certain view of knowledge as mastery of the world, of knowledge as a practice whereby you can enumerate the world on the basis of certain metrics or on the basis of certain concepts, and by that means possess it, and that the world is there to be possessed. It seems to me a deeply impoverished way of looking both at knowledge and of life itself, and of the possibility of engaging with an astonishingly complex, diverse, and glorious social natural world. Part of what I wanted to be able to do was to speak of things together and in relation to each other which are customarily not spoken of in relation to each other. Partly because part of what I wanted to be able to convey as experience, as sensory experience, and when I say, for example, that I am very concerned about the dominance of instrumental thinking, and in thinking about what the humanities or the arts could contribute to that, I think one of the things that the humanities and the arts could contribute would be to render fact as description, if you like, and to be able to take an abstraction and complicate that abstraction by means of rich description, which on the one hand can clarify concisely, precisely what the violence of that abstraction, what that abstraction occludes or obscures, and at the same time what that abstraction, what it would mean to actually live as though that abstraction were true. So you can do both simultaneously by attending to the richness of the sensory experience that abstraction by its very nature needs to negate, precisely in that process of moving away and out in order to describe a particular phenomenon or object of inquiry from a certain meta level. This is not an argument against abstraction. We use abstractions even in everyday speech, but it is a way of trying to think alongside, outside, and with and through abstractions.
It does.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does.
You know,
I'm just wondering that, I mean, this point of using certain forms of language or modes of thinking, like for example, when you talk about the grass cutter here, or you're talking about a particular shop, Parvati Amma, it renders the concept tangible on one hand, it renders it more immediate, it makes it intimate, it makes it humane. And since you locate that within the strands of the larger universe of interactions, so it's not as if the human is isolated from what's going on outside, next to or with it. All of this seems to point to understanding phenomena better. Why is it that the dominance of a certain mode of empirical thinking is such that this is rendered external, or this is rendered subjective, or this is rendered narrative-y, and therefore less legitimate and less credible, or somehow less authentic for that matter, when it does precisely the opposite? Is this the baggage that we've inherited from academia?
I think we are pointing to academic convention. Academic convention requires the exile of the personal experience, even though one should complicate that picture immediately, because there are many disciplines where for example, feminists have very, very strongly argued that the realm of experience is crucial to the making of theory. So the idea, for example, in the 1980s, US women of color came up with the notion of theory in the flesh. You know, so the idea of experience as being central to understanding social phenomena has been there, but how do you render that experience in such a way that it becomes part of academic protocol? I think frequently it can experience can be at the starting point. Experience can be data, you know, rendering that experience as rendering the personal experience alongside the analytical and mixing the personal and the analytical. It has been done, many people have done it, but it is certainly not the dominant mode of discourse. And
is it the throwback of neo-positivism and neo-positivism and what it still, and the hold that it still has on ways of thinking?
Absolutely, and I also think that there is a way in which the idea of expertise, and the idea of expertise seems to require an external relationship to the object of study. You know, it is you are the observing subject. It is the object that you are observing, and it is assumed as though the line of causality is the observer making sense of object, even though almost everything I say has to be taken back in a way, and that's the good thing, because it shows the complexity of the intellectual domain, right? Whether you are physicists or you are feminist sociologists, you will say that the very act of observation alters the object itself. The presence of the observer alters the object, and that the observer and the object are in a kind of dynamic relationship with each other, and it is in that dynamism that perception itself emerges. For me, the reason why the intimate became important is because it seemed to me that my own understanding was being altered by the objects themselves. The objects themselves were teaching me. And there was no other language, there's no other way to convey that except by mixing genres. I don't know if this is sounding abstract outside of the context of the book.
No, it's not for me at least. But we are going to come back.
But is it sounding abstract for people who haven't actually read the book? Because then maybe one can.
Yeah.
No? Okay.
Okay. I mean, Thomas Kuhn did it with science.
Yeah.
And he said that science itself itself is not an external object, it is embedded within, and so on. But this is a kind of nice segue for me to read perhaps what was the most startling part of this book. I mean this, and then to each his own, which is, and that is again deeply personal, which is the only part, in fact, which talks about your own personal experience of the accident. And would you like me to just read out that part, because
Sure.
I'm so excited about that particular aspect. So this is a quote unquote, this is page 86 of the book, in a chapter titled, "In Other Words, Beyond Antithesis," take 2. We don't have a take 5 here. 2 is good enough. So the context is that, yeah, I think she says, the first sentence of this chapter is, "We apprehend the world through the words we use and the ways in which we have come to understand them." And then there is this entire part about words and so on. And then here's what she writes: "I could have written these sentences in the 1980s when I was in graduate school, and they would have meant one thing. But I write them now from a different place. To say a little about this requires a brief autobiographical detour. In 1993, I suffered a head injury because of unwittingly being in the path of a high-speed car chase in which the California Highway Patrol was in pursuit of a stolen vehicle. The ensuing collision threw me into a realm in which I could not count on elementary cognitive functions." And here is the part which I found was the paragraph for at least for me. "One surprising aspect of the difficult period that followed was the simultaneous experience of things that my theoretical outlook at the time of the accident would have posed as binary opposites: wholeness and fragmentation, essence and constructedness. In ways that I cannot explain," I love it, "in ways that I cannot explain. I had a palpable sense of being whole, even as my cumulative incapacities made both perception and daily life a discontinuous, fragmented existence. Alongside this, as fatigue and inability to concentrate made speech a challenge, I sensed what I can only describe as the essence of each person in my environment. It was with this that I communed most often without recourse to language. While this essence was not itself a product of history, its hosts most certainly were." Would you like to talk about that? You go back to social construction. So this book is, I would say, after Interleaves and Sacred Secular, the return of Lata Mani, but in ways that we couldn't have conceived of, at least certainly not in the 1980s.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is now the autobiographical trajectory that has led me to write in this way and to think in this way, if you like. And that was Foucault talks about the element of contingency in historical explanation. Here is a contingent fact in my life that has shaped a lot of what has since happened. I was, as that paragraph mentions, I suffered a head injury, and part of that was complete mental disarray and complete inability to do the most basic things, including knowing that I was hungry. I mean, we're really speaking of quite a challenging time. But it was during that time that my entire epistemological framework came apart. I was very much a post-structuralist, a social constructionist, someone who did not believe in essences. I agreed with the post-structuralist critique of essences, with its historical nature and how it had been used in ways that were exclusionary, violent, partializing, etc. All of a sudden, I am in a space that one can, with the help of post-structuralism, describe as a non-narrative space, right? I'm in a space where it is unclear what the telos is going to be. It is a space of great indeterminacy, another post-structuralist term. It is a place of great unknowing, and it is a place of of very fragmented, discontinuous cognition. At the same time, however, I felt an incredible sense of the interconnectedness of things. This can happen spontaneously with brain injuries. It was not some achieved mental state on my part. It was the gift of grace. That's the only way I can describe it. Grace under a lot of fire, I should say. And I felt, I spontaneously experienced that the ways in which things were deeply interconnected, and I also began to experience what I can only call, or what I have since learned to call, the isness of things. In other words, it's not essence in the sense in which that term has been critiqued in post-structuralism, but it's a certain, it is a certain energy, quality of sentience, quality of aliveness that characterizes and distinguishes every single thing, person, right? Whether we speaking, we can call it, you know, whether you, everybody's isness is very particular to themselves. The isness of things is particular to itself, and it was that isness which I find a much more fungible and sinuous and flexible notion than, say, essence, you know, that I began to not just notice but experience, and not just experience but found myself communing without language, because language was difficult for me at that time, at that phase of the injury. So there was a part of me that on the one hand could not make a piece of toast or realize that I was hungry. There was another part of me that was effortlessly communing with everything in this wordless way, and noticing that people would come to visit me, but I couldn't find the language with which to talk to them, but I found myself communing with them. And it was a very intimate, it was an intimate exchange of wordless energy, which seemed to me like an enormous gift, because otherwise I felt I was on a planet all on my own, without the possibility of communication in the way in which one understands that term, primarily through the currency of words, right? I mean, that's what we normally use. So it was a fascinating time. I don't think I had the words for it. I would obviously not have the words to describe it in this meta language I'm using now to describe. I did not have, but I had a kind of a pure experience of it. As I got better, it became clear to me that I had actually moved to some other epistemological zone, and what would be the way to talk about this place. You know, I felt as though I were a traveler in a new country without a map. So what would be the places on this landscape, and how might one situate oneself in relation to it?
And with what tools? Because the tools at your disposal are only so much. You don't even have language with you.
Exactly, exactly. But I had color, I had feeling, I had states of heart, you know, and I had insight. One of the things that I realized was that the brain is a very, 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 very minuscule part of mind. It's nothing other than a small processor that just churns stuff up and processes things for you. Mind is huge. So my brain wasn't functioning, but my mind was very present. And this is the distinction I could not have made prior to this. Again, can I explain it? No, I can describe it to you. I can say to you that this is what I discovered. And I found that mind is at least is coextensive with the entire body, and that there are forms of intelligence that we actually possess that we are not aware of, because we don't generally think of the body as having its own intelligence. You know, the body is a supremely intelligent organism. Now I'm talking about mind, heart and body as though they're separate from each other. Obviously the brain is in the body and the mind is in the body, but you understand what I mean when I speak about the mind, the heart and the body, right? I mean, we tend to distinguish them, and they are distinguishable, even though they are remarkably interconnected, interrelated and interdependent in helping us make sense of the world. But we are much more aware of the operation of mind than we are as intelligence, then we are aware of the operation of either heart or body as intelligence. So I'm afraid we've gone off in this into this other realm, but I don't exactly know how else to describe the journey except in that way. So what happened when I came back was that I had to, when I initially went into this world, I honestly felt that I'd left my past training behind for good. One often feels when one has one has a new experience that is so totally transforming, as though the past is truly dead, you know. But that's just a moment in the journey, and part of pursuing or carrying on that journey is realizing that actually the past is not dead, it just re-enters the present in a whole other way. And a new kind of synthesis is what is required from you and of you as you move on with the journey. So in other words, it is a journey without end, but it is a journey in which both the past and the present and the future are dancing together in a complex, continuous tango, if you like, you know. And part of being cognitively honest is being aware, and being aware even when it threatens the very epistemological foundation of what you believe to be true.
How nice is that feeling, unburdening, and
it's actually terrifying.
Is it?
It's actually terrifying.
Not having to look over your shoulder anymore, and you know, or to what
well,
peers
initially,
are saying.
I think, you know, initially it's very, very terrifying, because, you know, you're being asked to step off the ledge of knowing. And one of the ways in which we bring order into our lives, into what seems like the chaos of infinity, is by imposing cognitive order.
Correct.
You know, so when that cognitive order, when the ways in which you might have imposed that kind of cognitive order is no longer not only accessible to you, but no longer intelligible, they no longer make sense, then you are in suspended animation. You're in a state of suspension, cognitive suspension, for quite some time. And the only way to continue that journey is to allow yourself to be in that state of not knowing. That's very terrifying.
Because here, this is not just about your experience. In fact, this experience is only about a paragraph, and then it moves into how we live, how we function, what are the natures of interrelations that we have, whether with each other as human beings or with the world outside. You hit at anthropomorphism, you get into ecology, lots of Buddhism strands of Buddhism in this, strands of non-dualism in this. So usually the obvious counter to dualism was monism, and here you've and that the fact that it's that you say that the fact that diversity as an organizing principle of life itself could lead to interesting detours, interesting crossroad conversations, could lead to interesting elements of the way we live and the way we are, which is where I think this integral, and when you say integral, and one thing I really liked about the book is how you keep going back to Latin roots of words. Remember is coming from body, member is body, integral again is to render whole, to cohere of sorts. So I felt that that this book is trying to do that, which is move beyond just personal experience into a realm of becoming political, social commentary, into cultural commentary, and so on. When you talk about neoliberal globalization and how it flattens out the space and doesn't leave you room for anything other than this or that, you're either for globalization or against, and so on and so forth. I think this book does a lot of entering that realm of living, so to speak, which.
Yeah, I mean, Sacred Secular, the journey started with Sacred Secular and trying to do that, because part of what happened to me, I have to go back to the biographical again for a minute if I may be allowed. Part of what happened to me in this transformation, this sort of with the brain injury, were various kinds of spontaneous spiritual experiences, and which is what reordered my understanding of the world. So the notion of the sacred entered my life, and I was a staunch secularist until that point. When I became well and I re-entered the world, most of my friends said, well, you can account for your personal journey, but how does this change how you analyze the world? And I had been ill from about 93 to about 99. I had barely left the house. And then I came to India in 1999. And there were two things that had happened during the time of my deepest illness. One was Hindutva, and the other was neoliberal globalization. India had been thrown open. So I thought, well, what better way to test this new way of seeing or understanding than in relation to these two, especially since I had ironically, as it were, discovered the sacred at a time when Hindutva was in the ascendant. And so it seemed to me that the secular response to Hindu fundamentalism was utterly wanting. Not only was it wanting, it was failing to convey itself to people who were not already inclined to be secular. In other words, people for whom there is a very deep cultural ethos, long old traditions of feeling that one is connected to something other than the human, that the human explanation alone does not suffice to help make sense of life or give meaning to life. You know, there are many complex traditions that are part of our civilizational inheritance, and they cannot be dismissed by fiat. You know, whether it's the fiat of a constitutional understanding of secularism, which on the one hand, which it's a strange thing, which speaks in a kind of folk tongue really. On the one hand says Indian secularism means all religions will be treated equal. On the other hand, Indian secularism also means that religion itself is suspect. You know, you have both. You have the tension between these two.
It does the belief practice bits.
Does the belief practice, exactly. Exactly. So it seemed to me that one needed to produce a critique of Hindutva that was not only secular. You know, one needed to add to the secular critique of Hindutva by pointing to the complexity of the sacred traditions, from within which it becomes very, very clear that Hindutva is fundamentally a political movement and is really cannot be, there is really no religious justification for it whatsoever, although religions themselves are highly complex and contradictory social and historical phenomena, and religion can be used to argue for or against virtually anything. You know, so once you have accepted that, it is entirely possible to produce a critique of secularism from within the sacred traditions themselves. So the moving into the world started with that book.
That must have been anathema to a lot of people at that time.
Well, it was, and that's why I took a different tack in this book in a way, because I mean in many ways I think unless you were already inclined to not be suspicious of the sacred, I doubt very much if I was able to convince the people who are fundamentally secular and unwilling to reconsider that position.
That was the Nehruvian legacy, I guess.
Yeah. I don't know if I managed to convince those folks. So I thought, okay, in this book, let me take a different tack. Let me step aside from the notion of the sacred. Let me take a very simple principle that would unite both the secular and the sacred lineages or inheritances, and that is the idea of interconnectedness and indivisibility. This is an idea that you find in all of our, in the most beautiful of our sacred traditions. When I say our, I would say the global sacred traditions. And it's also an idea that makes sense from a secular perspective, the idea that things are interconnected, the idea that things are indivisible. So let's take that idea, the idea of indivisibility and interconnectedness, and see how we can, how we see the world through that lens. What happens if we put that at the very center and examine the world from that perspective.
And the idea of equality, as you say.
Radical equality of all life forms, of all living things. So
your idea of dharma, as you say, is interdependence and radical equality. So that is itself a reclaiming of the sacred space from a lot of the regressive obscurantist kind of notions of the sacred itself.
Right.
And something which badly needs to be done.
Right.
Otherwise, the critique of the faith tradition is always coming from, it's like an apples and oranges kind of story, where, where it's like Tom Nagel saying, how do I know how it is to be a bat unless I'm a bat myself? And I can hang upside down from the ceiling, etc., etc.
Right.
But so, which is where I find that this is coming from someone who is deeply and deeply pluralistic and secular, if one were to, but does not believe in secular violence or in secular fundamentalism, just as religion's violence is so openly discussed, and the fact that you're willing to enter that space, take the bull by its horns, is something that, I mean, there are scholars who've done it, but a lot of it has happened outside academia again. It's something which is outside the gates of academia. It's almost that there is this invisible code of Cosa Nostra almost, where the sanctum of academia would not encourage discussion on. And I find that this irony, this contradiction of tolerance on one level and really tight, I think leads to some kind of a dissonance.
Absolutely, there's a totally superstitious fear of religion. I think if you really, what we really need is critical dispassion, and I don't know any academic scholar who would disagree with that. But somehow critical dispassion we don't seem to be able to bring to an understanding of those traditions. I don't understand why it is that it is so difficult for us to bring critical dispassion to bear on the question of religion and the complex history of religion, the violent history of religion, the contradictory history of religion. And all those three statements can be made about liberalism, secularism, and Marxism.
Is it? Yeah. Would you want to? Yeah, that's a sacred secular. Yeah. Would you like to say that the language of it is similar in a way? All of these ideologies in a way has a similar way of weaving their adherence in.
Yes. No, exactly. And somehow we're able to say this is what is absolutely crucial about Marxist thinking, even though I'm not a Stalinist. We're able to make that distinction, right? We're able to even acknowledge the terrific colonial violence of liberalism, and yet we don't throw liberalism out. And somehow we don't seem to be able to bring the same critical dispassion to bear on the equally complex history of religion. So, and I think it does a disservice. I think it makes certain conceptual resources not available to us, and I think that is the problem. That is the problem. And to go back to intimacy, we have allowed, even those of us who are critics of the logic of the market, we've allowed Homo economicus to help to shape our understanding of what it means to be human, to the point where even things like the notion of the personal or the private has shrunk in ways that a market would like you to imagine that the personal or the private or the intimate is.
You see that in the chapter name, which is called "Market is like that because we are like this." So is it what do they say?
The market is like that because people are like this. In other words, it's the people are like this because the market has constructed people to be that way, right? But it just flips cause and effect. And one of the things that is exciting to me is to actually to discover the countless intimacies of everyday life. I mean, how else do you rescue the notion of pleasure from a market logic, right? How else do you re-enchant the world? Whether you want to do it through a secular means, you want to do it through a sacred means.
Can we still do it through the market? Can we reimagine a market which is also critically? Can we look at it with critical dispassion and say that perhaps the market itself, or is it that the market is such a totalizing entity that it's perhaps very difficult to unbundle its various constituents, or is there some way out of this?
I don't know. I think that's an empirical question, actually, even more than a. I mean, the logic of capital. I don't know.
It objectifies. It
It
makes people
objectifies.
goods.
I mean, it functions in that way. I'm not sure what, you know. I don't know how to reimagine capital in a deeply egalitarian way.
But
I don't
exchange has
know.
always existed in
Exchange has always existed. We're talking about
This is a form of
economies of
exchange.
scale. Yeah. Yeah.
The other thing I mean, I found while you were talking about illness, which came to my mind, was this whole question of personhood. As somebody, as a student of law, I'm trained to look at rights. So you have what is called an entitlement approach to things, and you have an incentivized kind of market-driven approach, etc., to things. Both of which are predicated on the existence of both the state and the market. And then, if I were to locate personhood within that within that thing, I mean, I would say, in the entitlement approach, personhood would be like a bundle of rights, as you put in your book: a right to food, a right to shelter, a right not to be put in jail for certain forms of sexual conduct, etc., etc. It's almost as if I didn't have rights, or if these rights were not bequeathed to me by a benevolent state, it's almost as if my very personhood is taken away. Mm-hmm. For example, the Delhi High Court's judgment in the Naz Foundation case, which was set aside yesterday, said very eloquently, rights are being confirmed and not conferred. Something which Vikram Seth yesterday in a brilliant piece in NDTV spoke about. So, but that leaves this whole question of, and then, I mean, in your book you talk about this notion of rights, law and dharma, and then you say dharma is something much bigger, and there are aspects to it which perhaps the rights-based approach cannot take care of. And one aspect of it was personhood, I felt. If you don't have rights, then what are you? Do you need to be recognized by the majoritarian kind of sentiments of our time at that particular point to exist, to be? And yet you talk about, when you say you said dharma is inherent. Dignity is inherent, yeah. And that it's not a relative variable. It's something that you have, and it's not given to you by.
Right. This is a piece where I look at the idea of human dignity and suffering, basically, and we tend to feel that when people are suffering, there is a diminishment of their dignity. That suffering leads to essentially proposes that dignity has been diminished somehow, and it's an argument that we need to understand. I would say that dignity is an a priori. Dignity is. Everything is dignified. Suffering cannot diminish dignity, and the relieving of suffering does not increase dignity. It's a kind of a steady state. It's an intrinsic, inherent property. And the reason why this matters is because of the way in which, when we see those who suffer as having their dignity diminished, then those who are not suffering are always structurally positioned to rescue and save, or in other ways positioned as other to one who is suffering.
The victimization of misery.
Exactly. And I think that that puts you then in a situation where you as the person who's not suffering, but who might be a person who's standing with the one who's suffering, you're not equal. It just there is an inequality that enters the picture. So how do you? So my argument would be that dignity is an a priori. So, for example, yesterday evening I was listening to I was watching television. A lot of people said, you know, my dignity is assaulted by a Supreme Court verdict. I would say no. I would say that the Supreme Court, your dignity is unassailable. Your dignity as a queer person is unassailable, untouchable. What has been, what the verdict has done is that a certain social sanction for discrimination has been permitted by law. I'm afraid we've had a rather abstract discussion. We haven't read very much from the book. I don't know if this discussion makes sense to people in the room, and we can open up.
Yeah, we can open up to some questions. Yeah,
any questions, or if you'd like to hear a little bit from the book, one can read a little bit.
Yeah, your name, please, and yeah.
Hi, I'm Routledge, and I'm visiting here from UCL, doing my PhD at I work on housing specifically. I'm trying to understand transactions between landlords and tenants and executives. Many of these are global agreements. Your talk was a discussion was one of those things where every few moments I was going through and my mind would go off in a different direction.
The book makes you do that even more.
Yeah, so I was going to say that I haven't read a book, but I definitely love to, and I was just thinking I'd like to give it to my mother. Because she, unlike me, is I would say somebody who's faith and also secularism, and I'm a faithless secularist.
There's quite a lot for you in this book as well, by the way.
No, I'm sure. I won't read it. I loved your conception of the attempt of academia to possess the world and the violence of abstraction. Because I think that's kind of at the essence of what we as academics are guilty of at some level. But maybe, as you said yourself, maybe abstraction is necessary at some level in order to I wanted to ask, sorry, I'm going, instead of asking a question, I'm kind of generally making a comment. I'm trying to bring my thoughts together. If we were to try and look at pragmatist perspective, which an urban researcher must take because we're trying to do research in order to address certain kinds of problems, and we're problematizing them. So we're using theory. We're hoping to draw from theory, we're hoping to build theory in order to approach something which we see ourselves as rescuers, and we're guilty of that. But IIHS and other institutes are trying to reach out and figure out ways in which the urban problem and various other problems. If we were to try and think about a pragmatistic approach, where we go away from the epistemological and the ontological, because that debate is long and difficult, and we say, okay, how do we solve the problem? What can we draw from in terms of a shift in perspective where we're looking at multitudes? But complexity leads us into further complexity. And so the problem, unless we can define the problem, we don't know how to solve it. At least that's where theory has left us, or it's looking out.
Well, I would submit that everything I've said is supremely pragmatic. That because of the nature of our conversation, it has seemed very, very abstract. But for example, let me bring it down to a particular section in the book, which is called Avenue Road Suite, which is about 5 essays about a road widening, written in context of the attempt to widen the road in Avenue Road. If you know Avenue Road, it's in Bangalore. And it was maybe 2009, I think, when this started happening, and I went there with activists who were trying to figure out what would be the impact. We spent a lot of time, hung around there a lot, And it was very fascinating listening to the conversations. Now, some of the shopkeepers were only too happy for the road widening project to come through, because they felt that, you know, in the future nobody will want to come here. At best we can just leave the wholesale people here. Well, let's take the retail stuff and go to malls. There were other people who just loved it as it was, but just wanted the infrastructure upgraded, and they didn't feel like they needed road widening. Okay? Those who were in favor of road widening spoke of a future. It was a very abstract future. They didn't care about the present. They talked of the present as though it was a dead past, and that to me was a clue. Okay? The living present was rendered as a dead and dying past. Those who were interested in just cleaning up the area but retaining its current ethos were speaking in very concrete terms. So, you have the abstractions of the future-oriented people, and you have the extremely concrete about the web of human relationships, including the inequalities, including the tensions in the neighborhood, including the problems in the neighborhood. Now, and so they wrote up their various proposals for and against. And I was thinking, as a humanist, what do I do? And to me, what was it forcefully raised the question of genre. It seemed to me that those who were talking like this, mostly because some people are not willing to listen, basically. So what could I do as a humanist? I thought, okay, what I can do is I can evoke the world that will be lost, rather than seeing this as a problem of traffic flow, right? That the kind of the classic urban studies way of looking at it. You know, a problem of traffic flow, efficiencies, metrics, and, you know, let me try and at least give a sense of the kind of world that exists there, and what is the form of life that will be altered. What is the logic that is currently at play in that area, and what is the new logic proposed by the idea of the global city. So, in fact, everything that I'm saying is supremely pragmatic. It's about how to live, how to act, how to think, how to relate, and how to act, think, and relate in a way that deeply factors in the reality of interdependent mutuality and reciprocity, right? As opposed to a reordering on the basis of a spatial notion of the city from which history and people and culture are emptied. So I would beg to differ. I mean, I think the nature of our discussion may have given that. I'm going to read, shall I read A Street and a Road?
Yeah, that's nice.
I will just read one short, one essay, one little piece from that. It's called A Street is Not a Road. A street is not a road. True, they are synonyms, but street evokes much more. Roads connect points in space. They are moving corridors, metalled, unmetalled, raised, sunken, potholed, mud-packed, gravel-laden thoroughfares. Streets are life worlds, people in action, cultures in play. The street is a theater of contiguity, chance, conflict, and conviviality, a delicate, imprecise equilibrium. The broader semantic range of street is evident in our language. Street smart, the Arab street, the man on the street, express how the street is a site of sociocultural negotiation and political expression, while Dalal Street, Main Street, and Wall Street are examples of named locations that symbolize ideas even more than specific geographical coordinates. By contrast, One for the Road, Hit the Road, or Road Movie retain the relation of road to journeying, to the process of moving through. So it is that while boulevard, way, route, path, avenue, lane, or drive might suffice as alternatives to either word, there are others that apply to street alone, and these have to do with its meaning as cohabited space, residents, locals, occupants, dwellers, neighborhood. The tension between street and road is manifest in how widening a road can actually narrow a street in this broader sense. Street life is in inverse proportion to road width. Its vitality depends on either side of a road being within earshot of one another, on people, sound and activity traversing back and forth with ease, two halves of a whole in fluid embrace. This requires that a road be imagined in relation to the community it embeds, one axis among others in a living quadrant, not merely as a conduit to and from privileged destinations. When roads are not conceived as streets, they trespass. They encroach upon and infringe the variegated rhythms of life, its diagonals, zigzags and recursive loops, its alternatingly casual, purposeful, meandering character, its improvisational nature. The road becomes a border, slicing through neighborhoods, hemming in segments, reconfiguring localities, reminding us of the relation of road to raid, hostile incursion against person or district, foray. This meaning of road, common in the 16th century, is obsolete in the 20th, but its sense lingers in our use of the word inroad and in our experience of the consequences of city planning that focuses not on streets but on roads. So, when you start looking at interconnectedness, when you start looking at interrelationships, when you start thinking about the intimacy of everyday life, you begin to notice things, and you begin to notice things which are deemed intangible within an instrumentalist, technical, managerial way of thinking, but they are anything but intangible, because it's in fact precisely the intangibles that are coming back to get us by the short and curlies, as it were. Right?
Then it's called political economy and gets more respectability. What do you think is wrong with the way dominant modes of urban planning are? What's going on? What are the tools of use? What are the fantasies? What's the logic? How do they? What violence is being wreaked?
It's a miasma. I think it's a miasma. It's a miasma is a delusory mode of explanation, a delusory form of explanation or a delusory idea. But there are two dimensions to it. It is both illusory and delusory. I mean, illusory is seeing something that's not there. Delusory is imagining something that is there that is not. You see, I mean, sorry, I flipped it, but you get what I mean, right? Which is why when something is a miasma, it often becomes very difficult to use facts to convince somebody of something. They're absolutely convinced of their way of seeing and of what they think they're seeing, and no amount of facts seems to make the slightest bit of difference. Now, of course, there are entrenched positions that people take because they have certain prejudices, but even if you set that aside, the remarkable difficulty in having efficient communication, not that I like that word efficient communication, but the remarkable difficulty we have in communicating across our differences says something about our investments in certain ideas, right? And it seems to me that we are planning for places, not people. We are planning for segments of the population, not the whole population. We are not seeing cities as, we're seeing cities as being only about humans. I think I have a problem with the idea of human settlements. I mean, we have so many dogs and cats and birds and trees and all kinds of rodents, bats and crickets. We have grass, I think we need to move away from, on the one, it's very peculiar. On the one hand, we have human-centric and we don't take nature into account. On the other hand, even among humans, there's only a certain segment of the population for whom we are planning effectively. Because if you are going to imagine a city and you think of a city not in terms of forms of life, but in terms of a certain spatial and visual aesthetic, then I think violence is absolutely unavoidable. It's inevitable because you haven't started with people and or the interdependent forms of coexistence of scale that a city represents, you automatically will have all the repercussions of having started from the wrong premise. I mean,
and I think that's, I mean, Patrick Geddes, for example, lots of what you're talking about reminds me of Patrick Geddes, where he critiques notions of colonial town planning where which run a road through the middle of maybe a 100 or 200-year-old community, ostensibly in the name of sanitation, but forgets how well sanitation was organized within that community.
right.
And Lucknow, for example, even today bears the brunt of some of this kind of raising. And but that's, I mean, that's what we have inherited. Now, this is why my question about urban becomes urban becomes associated with a certain form of engineering and architecture of settlements. It's almost as if you are urban, you are by that binary definition, you're not rural, and rural is come to signify a certain form of essentialism. Urban has come to signify a certain form of essentialisms, and the twain don't meet. They meet sometimes in the hinterlands over land acquisition, in which case it becomes a marginal kind of discourse about the distribution of state largesse, so to speak. But nevertheless, the question still begs asking, which is what is going on? How is it that nobody is asking this question of what kind of visions would still be organic and would be in keeping in terms with interdependence, because surely we don't have the energy resources, we don't have the fossil fuels. What are we kind of, which world are we living in? And that's where you talk about, at the end, you talk about this notion of bounded potential as a principle. Would you like to elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that we are required to take into account in a very positive way is the notion of constraint. We have
Limits.
And limits. I'm not the only one to say this. I mean, everyone is saying it now, I think, because we're facing it in a very real way. But
we think we can fix it.
But we think we can fix it by cheating nature, by mimicking nature. I mean, there's a chapter here on geoengineering, solutions to climate change, and looking at how the diesel jeans advertisements, they create the kind of cultural conditions where geoengineering can seem credible. Yeah, right? I mean, that's because I'm very interested in the cultural logic of neoliberal globalization. We have a fantastic critique of the economics of it and of the politics of it, but we haven't paid enough attention to its cultural logic.
There are margins within margins,
right?
Even in the critique,
right? There are margins within even in the, exactly. So, what is it that makes some of these most preposterous, futuristic imaginations even seem credible? I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, we now every city now has a central business district, which is really not the not the hub of that city at all. And you can imagine a city of 7 million people like Bangalore, in terms of drains and pipes and freeways and cell phone towers. What kind of a description of a city is that, right? As soon as you take away the most living element in the city, which are all the living creatures, then it seems like you have this absolutely sort of spatial imagination, which has has a tangential relationship to reality. At the same time, the very things that are elided in these ways of thinking are also being reworked through advertising. That's one of the there are a couple of chapters where I look at advertising. One is diesel jeans, but there's another one I'm looking at there's an essay called The Phantom of Globality and the Delirium of Excess, where I basically feeding us with lies. It's not so simple, not at all. It's in fact, it is staging the dilemmas, the conflicts and the contradictions, but it's framing them in such a way as to offer certain kinds of symbolic resolutions of unresolvable social contradictions, right? So what we are then required to do is to imagine a different kind of discourse. And yet, even in our political discourse, I'll come back to this bounded potential in a second. Even in our political discourse, we often use an absolutist notion of freedom. For example, I have a paper coming out in EPW called Sex and the Signal Free Corridor, reimagining, the feminist, I think it's called Rethinking the Feminist Imaginary. trying to look at how it is that our idea of the city itself sets women up to be unsafe in cities, by positing a particular sort of contrast between where the city is posited as a space of mobility and freedom, where urbanization is seen as necessarily positive for women in a unilinear way, not taking the kind of complex and contradictory reading of urbanization process as we, for example, brought to bear on the colonial period and its impact on women, where we saw it as reconstituting patriarchy. So we have a similar dynamic, because as long as you imagine the city as a space of freedom, it's pleasure, danger, fun, possibility, aspiration, then you are all inserting women into a space which is going to be at the very least complicated and contradictory, right? At the same time, our notions of freedom can sound absolutist at times when we speak about the right of women to do this, the right of so and so to do that. And this is not an argument against rights, but what I'm saying is we need to have a notion of freedom which builds in the distinction, which builds in a notion of limitation or constraint, where you make a distinction between the kinds of constraints that are intrinsic to interdependence from the kinds of constraints that are socially legitimated because of structures of discrimination that we tolerate and see as legitimate.
It's so difficult to make that difference.
But we must do that.
Because power is everywhere.
Power may be everywhere, but we must do that. I mean, how else do you confront?
Or rather, the minute you're getting into that, it's possible that structures of power will immediately intervene and blur the distinction between the two, and render it an element of the obvious, which is control of various, and we see that all the time. How does one negotiate that? Because that's that constant thing of.
One negotiates it like one negotiates all structures of power. I think one with an agility, with clarity, and with a kind of unflinching commitment to understanding that all innovation takes place within a structure. I mean, we can pretend that there's no structure, but there is a structure. As soon as you're aware of the structure, even if that structure is not something that is either cognitively graspable or fully experienceable, or possible to entirely experience, it changes your relationship to the context within which your experimenting is taking place. It changes the relationship between structure and subject, to put it in another way.
More life worlds are safer streets. This is vintage 101's city design stuff.
Right.
An alienated highway is a much more riskier place to be for anybody. More questions? Amok?
Well, there's not really much of a question, but there was a comment earlier where you talked about the role of the observer and how the role of the observer, the presence of the observer can actually affect nature of the object. I would like to hear about the opposite, how the object
Yes.
actually affects the observer, because that is something that has happened to me personally. Every time I put myself in the environment, put myself in the setting, my views change, my opinions change. So, like if there's anything.
There's something in the book itself.
There's a lot in the book. In fact, there's a chapter on the tree, on a tamarind tree that's outside my apartment building, and how much I have learned from that tree. Because you often talk, nature is often talked about as something that relaxes or soothes or restores, but never as a cognitive agent. And I experience nature as a supreme teacher. Nature has been a supreme teacher for me, and so short of, I don't know if I can find a paragraph to read to you.
Does that mean, I mean, basically, I mean, the question is also one of identity, that there aren't fixed identities, that it's itself contingent and it's subject to, so there is no such thing as saying this is, but then that goes against the whole idea of essences, which is that. So when you say identity and isness, so this isness itself is also variable, I guess. Your isness might also change in that sense.
The expressions of the isness might change, but isness itself is a vibration, is a steady vibration. Which is why you always, when you know the people that you know, there is something ineffably them about them, right?
Sure.
And that's what I mean by isness. I don't know if that changes, but its expressions. I mean, it's dynamic, and its expressions changes. I'm trying to figure out. I can't find. I'll just read this paragraph. I don't know if this paragraph would work. But is human sentience radically different from and superior to that of the rest of nature? My suspicion is that it is not. To be sure, there are specificities to being human, animal, plant, or mineral. Still, it is not clear to me that these are to be understood as they have tended to be. Nothing that I witness from my balcony, the trees, bushes, grass, birds, insects, stones, anthills, is either inert or mechanically existing. Everything seems rather to be active and related. This is not to say that each exists because of the other, though this may be true in certain instances. Neither is it to claim that it could not be otherwise, that the particular scene is the outcome of some predestined grand conception. Wind, rain, sun, dew, tectonic plates, rocks, soil, animals, insects, birds, humans, etc. have made this landscape what it is. What appears as settled is the effect of multiple continual processes. What seems old may likely be of more recent origin than what appears new, and vice versa. Some of the relationships between and among what lies before me are evident to me. Others are not, either because they are not visible to the naked eye or because I do not have the requisite knowledge. And no doubt there are still other relationships, or for that matter non-relationships, that remain to be discovered by the human and natural sciences. The term relationship marks my sense of the non-randomness of what I observe. It is a way of naming its aliveness, integrity, the prospect of its intelligibility. So that, you know, there's a way in which, if we think about knowledge not as mastery, but as a process whereby you open yourself to being transformed by all that you encounter, by giving and receiving in equal measure, discovering what it means to give and receive in equal measure. In other words, if you see knowledge, knowing as a form of communing, then you can learn all the time, and you are leaving yourself open to the possibility of revising those syntheses at which you've arrived. You know, those that momentary understanding. I don't want to suggest that things are constantly changing rapidly all the time. Just if there is a dynamic between, say, fragmentation and wholeness, a dialectic between fragmentation and wholeness, there is equally a dialectic between that which persists and that which is transient, and different kinds of temporalities, whether we're talking about historical time, geological time, personal time, individual time, seasonal, cyclical time, etc. So
I'm just reminded of this. It's much quoted. I think it was an American Indian chief. I think Chief Seattle, when he gave the land, and the quote about how we are just the custodians of. And I thought there's a sentence here. I think it's in that Law and Dharma chapter where you say that how is it that we actively espouse and the rights of Adivasi communities, for example, without necessarily engaging in the worldview on which such communities are based. And I find that an incredible kind of dichotomy, which is again part of this.
Yeah.
I had this question which which I've been, as if everything is, and I face this in IIHS all the time, which is that if everything is interrelated, everything is so systemic, and I think it's related to the question Nikhilesh is asking, which is how and where do I intervene, and what intervention is worthy and what isn't, where do I start, and the obvious low-hanging fruit, so to speak, is Taylorism, which is breaking tasks into, and I think we're all familiar, rather familiar with what that means, is breaking the whole into various tasks and breaking those tasks into tasks and identifying people to do them, and you critique that as inherently dehumanizing and how it's alienating and so on. Now, I'm left bereft, but bereft is too hard a word, but I'm still trying to figure out how, within all this complexity, what is it that my one step, it's almost an existential thing, if my one step will actually harm, not harm, should I go left, right, up, down? What is it, what area is, it's like a Taleb Black Swanish kind of dilemma, which is, what is it really that really makes any difference? It of course opens up lots of possibilities, which means that a dominant way of looking at policy making in the urban, for that matter, if urban is at hand, may not entirely be true, because it might entirely be completely proved wrong, and it will unravel in 15 years, all these predictions, right? On the other hand, is it that, like Jane Jacobs' question, oh, I will go to the neighborhood and I will hang around the delicate side ballet of the street as an area of intervention, and then the policy makers would say, no, you can't look at scale. If you can't look at scale, you can't look at what the big picture is, and so on and so forth. So I'm left trying to grasp a manner of action, and that could itself be a reflective endeavor. Thoughts leads to.
Well, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Seeing that space differently. So how do we see critique? If critique is temporary, it's also, critique has to also, as you said, lead to, critique is also through action.
Mm-hmm.
So understanding and action go together. So then configuring critique perhaps, the idea of immanent critique has been thought of differently, and then it has to be enacted differently than we understand it today.
Yeah, excellent questions. I don't know if I'll be able to give a decent answer, but I will certainly give it a shot. I think the point of understanding that everything is interconnected does not necessarily mean and that everything is interrelated does not necessarily mean that we understand those interrelations at all, at all. Positing that there is a whole of which all of this is a part, and all of it affects everything else in it, also does not mean that we understand quite how that happens, right? At the same time, each of us sets out with a particular task, and yours, let's take, say, mine is not urban planning. Maybe urban planning is the task at hand. As an urban planner, how do you approach the object that you have set out to intervene in? How do you construct the object? How do you position yourself in relation to that object? So, for example, what is the imagination of the city? What is the normative imagination of the city with which you approach your task? Is that the only imagination of the city possible? What other ways might there be to imagine a space that we call the city? Is the city a space which with a clear boundary? It's not. There is so much in and out migration, not just in terms of the movement of people, but the movement of ideas, the movement of goods, the movement of cultural forms, ritual forms, agrarian calendar, ritual calendar. So many things determine what the edge of the city really is, right? So, I think bringing an expansiveness of consciousness to bear on the task at hand, and bringing what the Zen folks would call beginner's mind. That is, approaching your work each time as though you're encountering your lover for the first time. Why not think of the city as your lover? I say that because we bring a certain attentiveness, a certain mindfulness, and a certain tenderness when we approach anyone that we love, right? And it also means that the chances of us objectifying or othering are less. The chances of us paying attention to texture, tonality, detail, and color is greater, subtlety is greater, assuming that we approach our lover as a real equal.
One may attempt.
One may attempt, right? And there is no way you can approach a lover without being self-aware. Love is an inherently reciprocal process, right? So, in other words, that's why I'm using, and love is a doing word. It's not a state, right? It's a verb, really. I mean, it's an active orientation. So, bringing this kind of expansiveness makes it possible for us to, makes it possible for the very thing to which we are bringing a certain loving and attentive consciousness to transform right before our eyes and to transform us in the process. So, I think all I can propose is method, because in many, many ways that's all this book is. There are instance upon instance upon instance of practicing a method and manifesting what that method could look like as critique, right? So, care, love, attentiveness, but with some basic a priori. Now, what are my a prioris? That everything is inherently equal to everything else. Everything must be approached with care, but the care is not just an outward. That same degree of love that we are speaking of in how we relate to, say, the object of study here, in this case, being the city, must be turned in on the self. In other words, you approach yourself with the same degree of love as you approach the other. Because if you are not as self-loving if you're not self-loving, it is impossible to really deeply practice equality. It is impossible for it not to become a charitable act at some point in the journey, right? So, the method would be knowing that you can't know the whole, knowing that, for example, as far as if we are thinking of cities, I guess the question should be not how should the city be planned, but how do people want to live together? What form of life do we want to cultivate? And if there is a certain form of life that we wish to cultivate, what is the scale appropriate to it? So, maybe we'll go back to Jane Jacobs and say the neighborhood. In order to revitalize a city, let's revitalize neighborhoods, and then people will find the connections between neighborhoods and something like a quilt that will be a city of thriving, vibrant neighborhoods which are relatively self-sufficient. Maybe that will be the patchwork that will form a kind of coexistence that we might wish to strive for. I don't know.
If I
don't
were,
know.
if yesterday's judgment was an indication, as a student of law, if I were to try your method, or the method you're advocating, perhaps what needed to be done was the honorable justices to take 2 steps back and say this was not this minute detail matter of section 377 of the IPC and saying how many kind of intricacies of or legal artifices could be employed to do this, but perhaps takes 3 steps back and say this is about dignity. How do I ensure dignity? How do I ensure that personhood is acknowledged and respected?
This is about people.
And how is this about people?
It's about people's sexual natures. I mean, you know, if they had approached the 377 issue in that way, there's no way they could have come up with that judgment. The idea of, you know, so-called rights of the 1% minority, of a small minuscule minority. I mean, what sort of a constitutional principle is that? You know, you've already.
So that's already. I mean saying that that's already runs counter to the very notion of fundamental rights, which is that
Yeah.
one person,
It's not a, yes.
that one person's right will overwhelm if that right is a fundamental right. So I mean that itself is, shall we say, legally or constitutionally untenable.
Right.
But I said even otherwise, if the justices were to look at it from something around this kind of, is how do we cultivate a society where difference is an organizing principle, where people can live together as equals. Perhaps then the logic of looking at the little nitty-gritties here and there, and I am coming from the point of view of a lawyer, would perhaps have led to very different. But I mean, no, because the High Court had given such a wonderful judgment which affirmed all of this.
I would say that we have to rethink the High Court judgment also in terms of what it's doing. Yes, in terms of the steps you were saying that we should take back, but in terms of how the High Court performs the judgment, on what basis it holds the judgment to be valid, perhaps makes the same errors that the Supreme Court judgment makes and the same errors that the petition makes.
Because the foundational principles were not articulated as well as they should have.
Holding on to this idea of interconnectedness to make if the petition doesn't seem to hold on to that idea, the High Court judgment doesn't hold on to that idea completely, except for perhaps one statement in the judgment where it says that that within the Indian ethos, exclusion does not necessarily, atypical, that which is not typical does not mean that it won't be included. And there's that one statement in the end of the High Court judgment which perhaps undoes everything else that it has said in the rest of the judgment. In the same way that the Supreme Court also seems to, I think the problem is not just there in the Supreme Court judgment. It's something that if we are looking at this idea of interconnectedness, we might find that the problem exists in more than just that judgment.
Yes, I mean, I take what you say very seriously, because I think that if you start from the point of interconnectedness and interrelatedness, then I think the language of politics changes. And that is your point, and I would
more
completely
relational.
agree with it. Yeah, it's more relational. So we cannot be this republic of difference, right? I mean, and instead, in fact, I propose that we stop thinking of difference as otherness and separation or division, and start thinking of it as the play of specificity with an interdependent diversity. You know, and if you start thinking of difference as a play of specificity with an interdependent diversity, you have a completely other way of reading it. You know, so.
Yeah, I'll go back, not from the High Court, I'll go back to your urban planning. I work in villages, I work in Gram Panchayats.
Would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Shankar Prasad. I run a foundation called Sampurna Swaraj Foundation. We work in how to bring transparency in government at village level. But we are also looking at integral development of a village. For example, when you guys talk about integral planning of a city, you guys are sitting in a air-conditioned office, and you are looking at developing a city from your perspective. But your whole book is about integral nature. That is, how do you actually integrate? There are different kinds of people in Bangalore, as you can see, because I see that in the village. There are different levels of people with different cognitive capability, different consciousness level, etc., etc. So now the question is, how do you develop a plan which encompasses everybody's viewpoint, okay? Not necessarily the perfect one. So it's a planning, if you want to put it that way, in a democratic society that we have. So in order to do that, you will need to understand at what level of consciousness people are. Okay. So when we look at from that perspective, it's important to involve them in the planning. And if we do not do that, because that's what we are trying to do in the village. Okay. For some people, open defecation is okay. Understand? But for us, open defecation is not okay. From urban perspective. Now, how do I merge these two thoughts? And like that, there are 34 areas. For some, so some people, temple is more important. For some people, school is more important. Now, how do I approach planning from that perspective? And that, I thought, would be the topic you would address in your integral nature of things, particularly when it comes to planning in an urban or a rural society. So I wanted to just express my viewpoint and see how.
You know, I'm not a planner.
I know that. But since we started talking about Avenue Road, which is a very, very good example. Yeah. I mean, then you guys went into urban planning. So I just thought we should look at it from.
I think since we're talking about bounded potential, I think I've reached my boundary.
But point taken.
But the
And
point is,
absolutely.
yeah.
Including the one about the air conditioners. Including the one about the ACs. Yes. We don't have to be in this kind of environment.
No, I face this problem because people who plan anything rural, they have no clue of what is happening in rural in their plan. And which is, because I have worked for almost 10 years now, whether it's Jairam, Ramesh, Senra, it doesn't matter, whichever public policy, because I work in public policy. So people who have very little experience, and without taking the input from the people who are part of that development, or that's going to experience that development. It's a very
Lata talks about that right in the beginning in this book, where she's saying that this knowledge as this controlling kind of thing where I know and you don't, and I'm more educated and you're not, and I am kind of, you know, I've gone to some fancy school wherever, especially abroad, and you haven't. I can speak English and you don't, and etc., and so on. And that too, then I have these tools of understanding, comprehending, and perhaps grasping, which you don't, perhaps leads to these.
Maybe the question we should ask is, what do I need to learn in order to understand you? That's where the lover analogy, I think, works, you know, for the city even, you know. What do I need to know to understand this city? Beginner's mind, you know.
Beginner's
so
mind.
it's really, it's supremely practical, my friend, supremely practical. It's actually not abstract at all, but our conversation proceeded in that way, so we would have. Okay. All right.
Because there's now a whole field of urban journey that's trying to take or rebuild certain kinds.
I think post-structuralism, you've got assemblage. I mean, this whole
Yeah.
idea of assemblage
Yeah.
gets into things and experiences. Yeah.
There's an interesting paper which talks about transactions between people and space and objects. So something that's a continuum where space is being created in that relationship between these. Kind of, it can be connected vaguely to
I mean, I think the reason why I came back, the reason why I came back to you is that, you know, within Indian spiritual traditions, there's a tension. There's always a desire to remember, to only be concerned with the eternal, not with the transient, right? And there's always a desire to be suspicious of embodiment and the complexities of being human. And to me, it's not accidental that I'm in a human body, and I'm here in a human body. I'm going to take it very seriously. I'm going to pay attention. And I'm as interested in the transient, as in the midterm, as in the long term, as in the eternal, which is really only a conceptual idea. I mean, what do I know about the eternal, right? So if we bring these different temporalities and we embrace them all as equally potentially important, one thing we can certainly do is to undercut the tendency to not worry about consequences, which seems to be at the heart of so much thinking today.
Quarterly
urban planning.
consequences. Quarterly.
Only quarterly consequences. But
On the quarterly note, copies of the book are available outside at 10%,
yeah,
at 10% discount, and I think it's definitely worth a very good read. And more interestingly, I think it's worth a read after about a few years of work and then going back and see. It's one of those bedtime kind of books. Is stuff happening? Where is it? What's going on? I've just and it's also great. It's a great book also when you're recovering from a fever, as I was, and I think it has a healing kind of touch to it, which is very nice. Thank you so much. This is 9 o'clock. We started at 7. Yeah. We've been discussing abstract, so many abstracts, and I guess some of it was tangible. Otherwise, we wouldn't have hung around so long. And thank you so much, Lata.
thank you all for your
and
attention and for coming.
Let's have a round of applause for everybody.